Okay, welcome to Psych 235, Child Psychology. Today we're talking about adolescence. We're talking about cognitive development. So it's chapter 15. Okay, I consider this chapter to be interesting. Okay, usually cognitive development is not that interesting, but this one is because we're talking about adolescence. So let's get started. Actually, the first part is probably not too interesting. The first part has to do with Piaget, and we've been talking about Piaget throughout the semester as we go through his stages. That part probably not too interesting, but the rest of it is. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about Piaget. Then we're going to go into adolescent egocentrism, which is interesting. Inductive versus deductive reasoning, that's interesting too, and all the rest is interesting. Okay, we're not going to cover all of it today. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so the first thing we need to talk about is Piaget's theory of cognitive development. So the part of Piaget's theory that corresponds to adolescence is formal operational thought. That is the last stage of Piaget's theory, right? It's called the formal operational period, okay? So it's the fourth and final stage of cognitive development. It's characterized by more systematic logic and the ability to think about abstract ideas. Okay, let me explain that. The formal operational period or formal operational thought is characterized by basically you being able to think abstractly, being able to think more about in terms of ideas, things that aren't necessarily physical, right? Being able to imagine things that have to do, let's say, with like equations or logic, things that where you have to think about things and figure things out in your head, so to speak. Think abstractly about things that are not necessarily physical. Okay, things like this would have to do with things like math, more advanced math, physics, chemistry, philosophy, things like government, things like that. Those are more abstract ideas, right? Younger children struggle with that, but adolescents begin to, well, they start getting better at this stuff during this time. So examples can be seen in adolescent math, especially advanced math, right? Social sciences, when we think about society and things related to society, things that have to do with science, like I said, chemistry, physics, things like that. So we're talking about things that are more abstract, things you have to imagine, things that you can't always touch. Okay, so we're beyond the concrete now, moving more into the stuff that is more abstract. Okay, and let me talk about some of Piaget's experiments. So Piaget used some experiments to try to determine if people had gotten to this last and final stage of his theory, right? So Piaget and colleagues devised a number of tasks to assess formal operational thought. So they developed a balancing task, right? That requires balancing a scale and some weights. I'll show you an image in a moment. It requires some skill to logically solve the problem, okay? Because you have to imagine what happens if you move a certain weight in a certain direction, okay? And let's take a closer look at this task on the next slide. Here's the balancing task. You can see the image there. Younger children have more problems with this task. So you can see the image of the two young children on the top of the image there, A and B. So you have to balance. It's a balancing task. You have to balance this thing, and there are weights, okay? And the weights can have a different mass, okay? So you have to figure out where should I put the weights so that it balances, okay? And you can see the two children depicted at the bottom that are a little bit older are able to figure it out. So in C and D, right? If you have a large weight, for instance, on one side, and you have a smaller one on the left, and you want this thing to balance, well, then you have to move in the larger weight a little bit closer to the center, and the one and the smaller weight that is on the left needs to be a little bit further away so it bounces. And it takes some skill to figure that out. You have to be able to imagine things. You have to be able to think logically. Okay. This was the task, one of the tasks that Piaget used to determine if people have actually achieved formal operational thought. Okay. Yeah, that's the task right there. So let's keep going. Now let's talk about something more interesting. Let's talk about other things that have to do with logic, okay, and how it applies to oneself. So children are, or I should say adolescents are more capable of basically thinking abstractly during this time, using logic, right? But they still have some problems, especially when it comes to things that have to do with themselves, right? Thinking about themselves. They don't always do it very logically, okay? And there's something that's very characteristic of adolescence is adolescent egocentrism. What this means is that adolescents basically, they think about themselves in ways that are very self-centered, okay? And you can see with the image over here, you have these girls, I don't know what, maybe if they're in cheerleading or in drill team or something like that, but they're probably in high school. And this is very typical of adolescent girls. Look at them, right? Looking at their makeup, making sure that their hair is right and making sure they look good, right? Adolescents are very self-focused, very focused on their appearance. That's part of adolescent egocentrism. So it's a type of thinking that leads young people, those ages 10 to 14, to basically focus on themselves to the exclusion of other people. They focus a lot on themselves. So they're very self-centered, very egocentric. They care a lot about their appearance. They care a lot about their hair, about what they wear. If there's a zit on their nose or something like that, it's like the end of the world. They are very self-focused, very self-centered, very egocentric during this time, okay? So it's an adolescent egocentrism is an acute self-consciousness, right, about physical appearance that's greatest between ages 10 to 14. So remember, right, when you were about this age, this is the time when people are just very self-conscious, very self-focused, okay, very concerned about what, about what other people might think if they should have a zit on their nose or if they don't wear the right clothes. So they're very focused on their appearance. They're very shallow, okay? They care a lot about their appearance and what they wear. And it's just, that's called adolescent egocentrism. So they focus on themselves a lot to the exclusion of other people. Okay, that's adolescent egocentrism. So, they're extremely self-conscious. More about this, this egocentrism leads to other problems, okay? Egocentrism leads adolescents to interpret everyone else's behavior as if it were a judgment on themselves. So because they focus so much on themselves, they're so self-centered, so egocentric, they think that, for instance, everybody's looking at them. But they're very aware about themselves, but not so aware about what other people are doing. So they're very aware of themselves and they think that everybody's looking at them and everybody's judging them. And the reality is that other people aren't really looking at them as much as they think. So there's this thing called an imaginary audience. They believe somehow that everybody notices them, everybody's looking at them. It's like they're on stage, and therefore they're very self-centered, very egocentric, and they care a lot about their appearance, right? That's part of adolescent egocentrism. So the imaginary audience is other people who, in an adolescent's egocentric belief, are watching and taking note of his or her behavior, his or her appearance, their ideas, right? It makes teenagers very self-conscious. And, the imaginary audience also dominates online. When you are online, whether you're on Facebook, Twitter, or Snapchat, whatever you guys are using nowadays, it keeps changing, okay? Adolescents have this tendency to believe that everybody notices every picture that they post up there, everything they say, just like they think everybody notices how they're dressed and maybe that zit on their face or their hair. And the reality is most people don't care and don't notice you that much, okay? But that's part of adolescent egocentrism. They're very self-focused, very self-conscious, and they believe that everybody's watching them. And it's just not true. Okay. Some people are watching you and do care, but most people are not. Okay. More about this. There's also a something else has to do with adolescent egocentrism, is this idea of a personal fable. An aspect of adolescent egocentrism characterized by an adolescent's belief that his or her thoughts, feelings, or experiences are unique, more wonderful, and awful than anybody else's. Let me explain that. A personal fable, right? It's basically this idea that somehow your life is so interesting, right? Wonderful or awful or something, that your life is so interesting, and that somebody should write about your life. They should make a movie about you. They should write a book, or maybe make a play about your life. A lot of adolescents believe this about their lives, right? It's called a personal fable. A fable is a very well-known story that you may have heard of, like Aesop's fable, something like that. So this is something else about adolescent egocentrism. It leads them to believe that their lives are very interesting, and that it's just something that's very interesting and everybody should know about it. They should make a movie, they should write about it. They don't always believe that they should make a movie or write about it, but it's just very interesting to them. And that, you know, other people need to know about this. And of course, if you, you know, if you, well, if you use YouTube a lot, you'll see a lot of people on there that are basically sharing their lives, you know, with the with other people on the internet. And sometimes they're just doing regular things, but to them, their lives are so interesting, right? And they want other people to know about it. So there are some that, yeah, they make YouTube videos and they put their lives out there. And some of those people, you know, are interesting, but the vast majority of them are not. Okay, and that's the reality. The reality is your life is not as interesting as you think it is. As an adolescent, you think it's just interesting and everyone should know about it. It's just, there's something interesting about it. Maybe it's really wonderful, or it's great, or you're this amazing person, or that it's really awful and people need to hear your story about, you know, the awful things that you've had to endure. And the reality is that your life is mostly just like everybody else's. It's not that interesting. Okay, it's not as extraordinary as you think it is. But that's part of adolescent egocentrism. Very self-centric, right? Very focused on themselves. They think everybody's looking at them. They think their lives are so interesting and wonderful or awful. And it's just not true. The reality is mostly you're like everybody else. And most people don't care. And most people are not looking at you. That is the reality. There's also something else that's very common during adolescence, and this is a little bit more dangerous. There's the invincibility fable. An adolescent's egocentric conviction or belief that he or she cannot be overcome or even harmed by anything that might defeat a normal mortal, such as unprotected sex, drug use, or high-speed driving. Let me explain that. The invincibility fable is this idea that somehow you're going to be okay, that nothing's going to happen to you, despite the fact that you engage in risky behavior as an adolescent. Think about it, right? Having unprotected sex is very, very risky, though more than half of adolescents actually do that. They think that, oh, it's not, you know, those bad things, not going to happen to them, right? They're not going to get that sexually transmitted infection. They're not going to get pregnant. Oh no, they're not going to have these problems, right? Yes, they are, okay? You are very vulnerable during this time, especially during this time. And adolescents engage in this risky behavior thinking that nothing's going to happen to them, right? A lot of them will experiment with drugs, thinking it's no big deal, right? That nothing's going to happen. It is a big deal. People get addicted. You meet, you know, people who are dangerous. It's actually very, very risky. Or high-speed driving. When adolescents do learn how to drive and they do get to drive, right, they often want to drive really fast, okay? And listen to loud music at the same time that they drive and have their headphones on, or maybe even texting while driving, all extremely risking behavior, right? Though they've heard of other people getting into accidents when they text while driving or they talk on the phone while driving, they think that somehow it's not going to happen to them, that they are going to be okay, that they're going to be the exception. That's the thing about the invincibility fable. Adolescents engage in all this risky behavior, thinking that it's going to be okay, nothing's going to happen to them. the image right here, right? These young boys, or I don't know how old they are, maybe 13, 14, right? Going out there with their dog out there, you know, with their ATV and with these guns, real guns, by the way. And because they're adolescents, they probably drive too fast sometimes and want to show off. You know, they play with these guns as if they were toys, thinking that nothing's going to happen to them when they're actually doing something very, very dangerous, handling guns, riding a vehicle like that. They could flip over and you can break your neck and die, right? It's actually very, very risky, but adolescents fail to perceive this threat, this danger. Because they're young and they have a lot of energy, they think that somehow nothing's going to happen to them. They're not going to get hurt, that they are not vulnerable. They think they're always going to be young and healthy. No, and what happens is you eventually get old and die, and you can die while you're young too. You can get hurt while you're young. And remember when you were this age, right? Remember the stupid things that you wanted to do, right? Remember, right? You wanted to have you know, you wanted a car that went fast. Remember, had a lot of horsepower, right? Especially if you were a guy. And if you had a car like that, you probably, you know, drove too fast. You wanted to party a lot, remember? Right? Partying, drinking, right? Even though you weren't legally able to drink. Guess who's at those parties? Bunch of strangers mostly, people you don't know. Very often dangerous people. But you're there partying, you know, trying to have a good time as if you're not in a very vulnerable position, and you are. And that's just the reality, you know, of adolescents. They want to do all these crazy things, engage in all these risky behaviors, thinking that nothing's going to happen to them. And as you get older, by the way, you're going to realize, you're going to look back and realize that a lot of things you did were risky and stupid. And it's just the way it is. You know, I did things too. I still love to go hiking, but I used to love to, you know, I still like to hike, but I used to go out there in the wilderness with my friend. We went a couple of times in the winter, not knowing that it gets really cold up there, thinking that we were going to be okay. We didn't even know what we were doing, and we almost froze at night. Okay. And then we didn't even have enough water. We almost died of thirst too. Just going out there thinking like, yeah, we're young, we can do anything. Like, no, you can't do anything. Okay. And many times when we went hiking too, we would deliberately go off the trail and pick the hardest route up the mountain. Why? Because it was fun, but it was also very risky, and we could have easily have died. That's the kind of stuff that I did when I was younger, right? Because I couldn't really afford a car, and my parents didn't buy me a car. But if I had one, I probably would have been irresponsible with it, probably would have driven too fast, and maybe even crashed a stupid thing. There's a reason why if you put an adolescent on your insurance policy, why your car insurance goes way up, because the insurance companies know that adolescents engage in very risky behavior when it comes to driving, and they're more likely to crash that car, ruin that car, run over someone, end up killing themselves, and therefore you pay more for insurance. That's the invincibility fable, this idea that you can do anything and nothing's going to go wrong. It's not true. Other things about adolescence, we need to differentiate between inductive and deductive reasoning, and we'll talk about which one is which is more of an advanced form of thinking than the other. Inductive reasoning is when you reason from one or more things to one or more specific things or facts to a general conclusion. So inductive reasoning is when you reason from specifics to general. Okay. Let me give you an example. The easiest example I can think of that a lot of you have probably heard of. Okay. If it waddles, it quacks, it has a beak, it has webbed feet, it's a duck, right? So specifics, from the specific things, you reason to the general. It waddles, it has webbed feet, it has a beak, you know, it's a duck. Okay. This is less cognitively advanced than deductive reasoning, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. So this one is less advanced. Okay. And this is also sometimes called bottom-up processing. Now, a more advanced form of thinking is called deductive reasoning. When you reason from something general, right, a general premise or principle, through logical steps to figure out these specifics. Okay, sometimes called top-down processing. So deductive reasoning is the opposite of inductive reasoning. An example, a simple example would be, it's a duck, therefore it quacks, it waddles, right? It has a beak, it has feathers, that kind of reasoning. So inductive reasoning is when you reason from the specifics to something general, and deductive reasoning is you reason from something general. First, you start with something general, and then you figure out the specifics. And deductive reasoning is considered a more advanced form of thinking than inductive reasoning. And let's give you an example about that. So children reason more inductively. For instance, that some people are prejudiced. When it comes to thinking about prejudice and racism and things like that, we've all heard about it, okay? The way children think about the problem is they reason inductively. They reason that there are some people who are prejudiced. Some people are racist, right? That there's some bad apples out there. And that's what's happening. That's the way children think, right? They see or they hear about the specifics, right? And, you know, and they think that, well, they reason about this, okay? That's inductive reasoning, okay? Now, adolescents, on the other hand, are usually capable of more advanced forms of thinking. They think deductively that racism is society-wide, right? That it's more of a general thing, right? And they're more likely to think about things that have to do with policy, okay? Policy solutions, laws and rules and things like that. So the point is, adolescents here are more likely to think about the general problem, okay? That racism, prejudice is something that is actually widespread and systemic. I'm sure you guys have heard this term a lot lately, systemic racism. That is a widespread societal problem. It's not just about specific people here and there. It's a big problem. It's a general problem. It's a societal problem, okay? And therefore, we have to tackle it at a society level. That is more advanced thinking, okay? Than to think there's some people here and there who are racist, and that's really what racism is. That's how children think. That's inductive reasoning. And by the way, there are plenty of people out there, including politicians, who view the problem that way and say, no, we don't have a problem with the police department. It's just a few bad apples here. No, wait, we don't have systemic racism. It's just a few bad people here and there. Like, and anyone who thinks about the problem deductively would come up, you know, with a different explanation. Is that no, it's not a few bad apples here and there. We have real systemic racism. It's a societal problem. It's a problem at every level of society. It's in politics. It's in education. It's in healthcare. It's in housing. It's in economics. It's everywhere. Racism, prejudice. Well, let's talk about racism, right? It's everywhere. It's absolutely everywhere. It is a general problem. If we think about it deductively, we will come to that conclusion. But there's plenty of people out there, adults, thinking like children, that it's just a few bad apples here and there, right? They're thinking inductively. They're thinking about the specifics and saying that's racism, just a few people here and there, when really it's a more widespread problem. If we think about it deductively, we think about it as a whole more generally, we'll see that it's actually a societal problem. It's very widespread. It is systemic. It is institutionalized. And the more we think about it, right, the more we arrive at that conclusion. Now, adolescents are capable of that kind of thinking. Now, they may not come to that conclusion, of course, because as you'll find out, I think in the next chapter, adolescents tend to believe what their parents tell them. And it just depends on what their parents believe about a problem like racism. Okay, because remember, we have people who believe different things about that. If you're on the receiving end of racism, you tend to believe, you know, one thing. If you are not on the receiving end, then you tend to think it's not a big deal. Let's keep going. Two modes of thinking, intuition versus analysis. Something else that's very interesting about adolescent thinking is that is these two forms of thinking, when they engage in intuitive thought and when they engage in analytic thought. Okay, that's dual process thinking. Dual process means two ways of thinking. So two possibilities when it comes to thinking for adolescents. So intuitive thought is thinking that's based on an emotion or a hunch, right? It's like emotional thinking or a hunch. It's your intuition, right? It's something that doesn't really have a rational explanation, and it's influenced by past experience and cultural assumptions. So it's basically when you think emotionally, intuitively, you're not really thinking logically. Now, logical thought, analytic thought, that's something different. Analytic thought requires analysis. such as a systematic ranking of the pros and cons, risks and consequences, possibilities and facts, right? Analytic thought depends on logic and rationality. So analytic thought is more careful thinking. When you think about something and you think about, what are the pros and cons? What are the good things about this? What are the bad things about this, right? Let me think about this in an intelligent way. Let me use logic, right? Let me do some more analysis. That's analytic thought. That's careful thinking. That's the way we would want adolescents to think, but they don't always think that way. They can also think intuitively. They can also be emotional or just go on a hunch, right? I'll give you an example. Now, not all adolescents are going to be able to afford a car, or their parents aren't always going to be able to give them a car. But when you're an adolescent and you want a car, what kind of car do you want? If you could, get a car, like what kind of car do you usually want? Now, because adolescents are very intuitive, very emotional, they will often say that they want a car that looks good, right? They want a flashy car. They want one that goes fast with a lot of horsepower, one that's going to get them a lot of attention. That's your intuitive thought right there. Being emotional, right? It's not really rational. You're just being emotional. It looks good. I'm going to have fun, right? People are going to like me. That's really why you want that flashy car. If you engage in more analytic thought, you would arrive at a different conclusion. You would think differently. You would say, okay, well, I want this car over here. Why? Because it's a car that is reliable, right? One that's not going to be breaking down all the time. Or it's one that, for instance, is safe. It's one that I can afford, right? Or that my parents can afford, right? To make the payments. That's more analytic thought. And when you get older, by the way, you're more likely to think analytically. Like right now, I'm older, right? And I think more analytically than intuitive. When I was an adolescent in the past, I would be more intuitive. I too, when I was younger, wanted that good-looking, flashy car that goes fast and has a lot of horsepower, just like a lot of people. And it's not just guys, by the way, it's also women, right, who also think this way. But I'm giving you an example that's kind of more male-focused, okay? I was like that too. Thankfully, I was poor when I was younger and I couldn't afford a car, right? And my parents couldn't afford to buy me one either, so I didn't get a car. So I didn't basically get to drive a flashy, car that got me a lot of attention. I think that was a good thing, because if I would have done that, if I would have had that, I probably would have been irresponsible because of the other things we talked about. I probably would have driven too fast. I probably would have crashed the stupid thing. I might have hurt myself or somebody else. But that's how adolescents are. They think intuitively. Now that I'm older and I could actually afford a nice flashy car, right? A car with a lot of horsepower that goes fast and things like that, I don't want it anymore, because now I'm more logical. I'm more responsible. And though I can afford it, I would not buy a car like that. There's plenty of people my age and younger, right, who are beyond this adolescent stage, who still think that way, by the way. And those people are basically still thinking intuitively. They're still thinking like adolescents. They still are going with just emotion. And that's what they want. And as an adult, especially when you have children, you need to think more logically, right? So here's the thing. When it comes to adolescents, they prefer emotions, right? They prefer that emotional, intuitive thought. Rational judgment is difficult for them when egocentric emotions dominate. So because they think that everybody's looking at them, the imaginary audience, because they're so self-focused, concerned about their appearance, because they think their lives are so interesting, their thinking is very emotional. So if they could have a car, they want one that's going to get them a lot of attention, one that goes fast, one that has a lot of horsepower. And I know most people, when they're adolescents, cannot afford that, or a lot of them, their parents cannot afford it. But that's what adolescents want if they could have it their way. And there's plenty of people who are privileged, who can have that, and parents do get them that. And it's a very bad decision on the part of their parents to get them something like that. But that's what adolescents prefer. They're very emotional. They want to party. They want to have a good time, right? They're not necessarily thinking rationally, right? That I could get hurt at this party, that I might get addicted to these drugs, right? They're very emotional and more intuitive when it comes to thinking. It's more about their gut feeling. It's about how they feel. It's about, things, being interesting. That's what they care about. Experience in decision-making and thinking facilitates more use of analysis. They need more experience, right? In making these decisions. They need more experience, right? When it comes to, let's say, handling a bank account or having a car. And as they get more experience, they will learn to think more logically. I remember when I first got a bank account. I got a bank account and I got a credit card. And you know what happened to me? Before I knew it, I had spent all the money in my bank account and I was in debt. And I didn't even know that my credit card had a monthly fee. And I owed money to the damn credit card, even money that I didn't know I was going to owe. And that's because I was inexperienced. And just like all adolescents, I wanted money to spend. And I got a credit card thinking that everything was going to be okay. And I didn't know what I was doing. And I got this in adolescence, by the way, when I was like 16, I got an older adult to kind of co-sign for me so I can open a bank account. It was actually my cousin, not my parents, who kind of co-signed for me so I can get a credit card even before I was 18 years old. I don't know if you can still get a credit card before you're 18. But I wasn't ready. I was very emotional in my thinking. I wasn't thinking rationally. And before I knew it, I was in debt and I owed the credit card company money. And I didn't even know what I was doing. I wasn't keeping track of what I was spending. And I learned a very valuable lesson. It took me a while to pay off what I owed to the credit card. I actually called them up and they told me, they gave me some good advice. They told me, I advise you to rip up that credit card and pay off the debt. And that's what I did. I cut it up, I ripped it up, I threw it away so I couldn't, use it anymore. And then I slowly paid down the debt. And eventually got rid of it. And it taught me a very valuable lesson about money. That's what adolescents need. They need more experience. So go ahead, let them open up a bank account. Let them, get a credit card. Although make sure they have some very low limits. Don't let them get into thousands of dollars of credit card debt. Make sure and let them learn those lessons for themselves. And don't, as a parent, don't pay it off for them. Let them struggle. Let them pay. Let them learn these things so they think more rationally. I'm very thankful that I had that experience when I was young, because now I'm actually very good with money because of that experience. Okay, I'm not like the typical American who has like $15,000 of credit card debt. No, I don't have that. My cars are paid off. If I do charge anything on my credit card, I pay it the same month. I don't even get charged any interest. Okay, I'm very responsible. But that's what adolescents need. They need more experience in making these decisions, and that will make them more logical, more rational in the future. They need to learn from experience. They don't always learn from you telling them, by the way. More about this two forms of thinking. So why do we have this intuitive, emotional thought versus this rational thought? Well, there's different parts of the brain that actually have to do with that. Okay, there's dual processing, in the brain. Okay, there are the subcortical regions in the brain, and by subcortical, we're talking about, what that means is that we're talking about areas of the brain that are below the cortex, below the cerebral cortex. Remember, the cerebral cortex is that part of the brain that's the surface area that looks wrinkly. Well, subcortical means below that. Below that, you have the limbic system, which is the part of the brain that has to do with emotional thinking. It involves things like the amygdala, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, things like that. So that's the part of the brain, for instance, that makes, people want to engage in sensation seeking, right? To seek those thrills, to seek out emotional novelty, things that are new, to seek out reward, things that make you feel good. That's because of the limbic system. It's also called like the, emotional part of the brain, or the reptilian brain, a primitive part of the brain. It actually develops more rapidly after puberty. This is something that develops rapidly, so it's actually quite well developed during adolescence. And therefore, adolescents are very emotional in their thinking, right? And they seek things that make them feel good, things that are exciting, right? That's all because of the limbic system. Now, the cortical regions of the brain develop a bit later. They develop through early adulthood. The cortical regions of the brain, we're talking about the more advanced part of the brain, the cerebral cortex, especially the prefrontal cortex, that takes longer to develop. Like, for instance, the prefrontal cortex is one of these parts of the brain that helps you basically helps you plan, helps you control yourself. It helps you focus. I think I mentioned this before, but that's the prefrontal cortex, the very front part of your brain, right? Helps you control yourself more, think more rationally, right? To plan, to control your emotions, control your behavior. And that part of the brain is not really fully formed during adolescence. It's actually not completely developed until, according to some research, the late teens, even the early 20s. And that explains a lot about the way adolescents think. Adolescents are more emotional, more intuitive. They are less rational, less analytical. And it's because of this. It's because their brain, the front part of the brain that involves that rational thinking, that planning, right, that impulse control, isn't yet fully developed. Let's keep going. More about logic and the self. So in adolescence, development moves from egocentrism to abstract logic. So they start out being very egocentric, right, at the beginning of adolescence, and they become a bit more rational as they get older, okay? And that's because of brain maturation. As the brain matures, especially the front part of the brain, they become more capable of basically thinking abstractly, thinking logically, thinking more rationally, okay? They have more intense conversations. As they become adolescents, they develop relationships, they have very deep, meaningful friendships, and they have more intense conversations. And all this helps them think rationally about things. Schooling as well, you know, they learn how to think rationally in school and logically. You know, the things they learn about math or social studies or whatever else they're, you know, they're learning in school. It gets a bit more advanced and more is expected of them as they get a little bit older. And this helps, of course, with them developing this, you know, more formal thinking, more abstract thinking. It helps them become less egocentric as they study these different things, whether it's science or math or social studies, whatever they may call it, where they learn about society and the challenges of society, other things, you know. There's moral challenges that come up, right? Dilemmas that they face, you know, with their friends, with their parents, and they have to think about those things rationally, right? Increase independence. As they get a little bit older, they're granted a little bit more independence, a little bit more freedom, and there's going to be more challenges. There's going to be more things for them to think about, new experiences. And the more they have experiences like this, you know, the more practice they're having thinking about how things are and how they work, instead of just being emotional about it. Let's keep going. Trends in impulsivity and sensation seeking. Here's a graph over here that shows you how being impulsive and sensation seeking kind of varies as people get older. So the pink line is impulsivity. So you can see at age 12, you know, people are very impulsive. During adolescence, people are very impulsive. Impulsivity basically is doing something without thinking. It's doing something just because it feels good or just because it seems interesting, right? That kind of thing. Okay, very typical of adolescence. So you can see it's very high during age 12, and then it goes down. Age 14, 16, it goes down dramatically, you know, and then kind of by the time you're about 22, the time your brain is fully developed, you're not so impulsive anymore. It goes up a little bit in your 20s, it looks like, because people who are in their 20s, they still party, they still like to have fun, right? That kind of stuff, right? So you can see impulsivity, right? Doing something without thinking, right? That trend kind of goes down, okay, as you get older. But look at sensation seeking there. Sensation seeking is basically seeking out thrills, things that are, you know, interesting, wanting to have a good time, right? You can see how it's a little bit lower at age 12, right? I mean, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, they're a little scared, okay? They're not as high on sensation seeking, but it goes up as they get a little bit older. 14, it's higher. 14, 15, 16, you know, they want to have a good time. They want to party. They want to hang out, right? They want to seek those thrills, right? And then it begins to decline. You know, closer to age 18, it begins to decline, and then you don't seek that stuff out so much. Okay, so both sensation seeking and impulsivity go down as we get older, but sensation seeking goes up during adolescence a little bit, stays high for a while, and, you know, and then declines. So adolescents become less impulsive as they mature, but they still enjoy the thrill of a new sensation. So if you're talking about the adolescent year, right, 12 to about maybe 18, right, you can see that, especially for 14, 18, that, you know, sensation seeking is still high. Adolescents want to have a good time. They want to party, they want to hang out, doing drugs, that's sensation seeking as well, right? But you can see them doing something without thinking, that just declines rapidly as they get older. So better thinking, so intuitive decisions. Here's the thing, I've been talking about thinking intuitively, emotionally, right, versus thinking analytically. And I've been saying that analytic thought is better, right? But it's not always better, okay? There are some circumstances in which intuitive decisions, you know, may be better. Most of the time, intuitive decisions are not best, okay? With maturity, adolescents gradually balance formal analytic thinking and emotional experiential thinking. So here's the thing. So I've said that already, yes, that intuitive thinking, emotional thinking, that's not always the best. That's not a very good thing. Analytic thinking, logical thinking is better. And with experience, adolescents get better and better at that. But there are some times when intuitive thinking is actually okay, when it's actually a good thing. Quicker, emotional, intuitive thinking is actually sometimes better than analytical thought. In some circumstances, thinking in that way is actually better. And one example of that is sports, right? When you do play a sport, whether it's basketball or football or whatever it is, it's actually better to think emotionally and intuitively, to listen to your body, to go with your gut feeling. You don't really have time to kind of stop and think and try to figure things out. You just have to act when you play sports. And if you're going to be good, right, you're going to be very intuitive. You just kind of know what to do without thinking about it. And that's one instance in which intuitive thinking is better. But in most cases, analytic thought is better. But if you're talking about being an athlete, if you're talking about being an artist, a musician, in those cases, emotional intuitive thought is actually better, because that's the creative part of you, okay? But most of the experiences you're going to have in life are going to require you to think analytically, to think more carefully and more logically. And you know what? That's where we'll stop. I'm about halfway. So let me go ahead and stop this recording. We'll cover the rest next time.